as humans, we're actually pretty good at adapting to new technologies, but we tend to really just look forward and think about that adaptation. But I want to encourage you for a second to look back at how far we've come. A great example of this is the history of the elevator. We saw the world's first passenger elevator in 1857. Within a few decades, we saw the automatic elevator. Now, I'm sure you can imagine in 1857 how terrified people were about getting into an elevator that would take them up within a building, and yet how important this innovation has been to the history of cities, allowing, of course, for vertical transportation. Eventually, people got comfortable in elevators, not really thinking twice about getting into those elevators, and that happened over time. Well, when we think about what's different today in 2020, especially because of COVID-19, the difference is that change has never happened this fast before, and it will never be this slow again. There's an acceleration right now that is taking place in the technology space. Things that we thought might have taken 5 years are now taking mere months. There are plenty of examples of this all over, and not just in technology. One of my favorite examples of adaptation is not from adults in the business world, but instead to look at students who headed back to school this September. We saw all the students in their masks, and more importantly, if we look at one example of adaptation, we can look to the class of Mrs. Allison, who has a grade 3-4 class. When she was told that the children were not allowed to sing O Canada in class, instead of saying, okay, we're just not going to do the national anthem, what she decided to do was to practice this idea of relentless adaptation and teach the children in her class how to sign O Canada every morning. And when we think about this adaptation and this change that we're experiencing right now, there's no better place to look than e-commerce. As we can see here in this article from TechCrunch, when we talk about e-commerce, we've seen changes now that account for about 5 years of progress that have happened within 6 months. So we know again that just because perhaps we're slowing down as a society a little bit, the truth is technology is only accelerating. So what I want to talk about today is 3 specific trends that are accelerating during this time. And the trend that I want to start with first is this idea of voice-first communication. We're entering this voice-first era, and again, it's a technology trend that is accelerating right now with more people at home and more people using technologies in their homes like smart speakers. As one example, we know that 50% of all searches will be voice searches in 2020. 50% of all searches. This is a stat that has been out for a couple of years and a stat before COVID-19. So just imagine how much that has changed because of COVID-19, again, with more and more people in their homes. And when we think about smart speakers and we think about that adoption, we've been experiencing something over the past few years called hyper adoption. This idea that it no longer takes 10 years for consumers to adopt new technology. Instead, we're seeing those changes in just a few short years. And again, COVID-19 is only accelerating that. You've probably been changing and adapting over the past few months more than anyone because you're forced into that position. And it also means embracing this idea of constant learning, embracing a learn-it-all culture. And so before we break for the final Q&A, I want to leave you with this quote. The illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who cannot read and write, but those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. That is the future that we are going into, a future where we're ready for change every single day. Because after all, if we think about what happened in just more than a decade, starting in 2005 with consumer technology, and we saw the changes that I showed you off the top of the presentation, changes up until 2020 of this year, we're none of us would have anticipated. Imagine what's going to happen over the next few years, knowing that we have two things taking place that are layering on top of each other. One being this acceleration of technology trends, and the other being COVID 19. And you can only imagine that many of the things I talked about today are going to happen faster than any of us ever imagined.